Hello, my name is Connor, and today I would like to tell you the story of my spiritual journey up until this point. On this channel, I would like to tell you about, I suppose, topics of a spiritual and occult nature mainly, as these are things that I'm strongly interested in. And I thought the best place to start would be just with where I've been and where I've got to so far in all of this. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. You might even find it relatable and possibly even helpful if you yourself happen to be going through some sort of spiritual crisis, because I certainly have, particularly actually over the past year, has been very intense for me. So yeah, but without further ado, just a bit about my background. As you can probably tell from my accent, I have spent most of my life in Scotland. I still live there today, although I was born in England, but only lived there for a couple of years before moving up here. My father is Scottish, my mother is Irish, and in terms of my religious background, I am technically a member of the Church of Ireland. I'm technically a Protestant, but that doesn't really reflect my actual upbringing. My parents, when I was growing up, were not religious or spiritual at all, I would say. Despite this, I did get sent to a Church of Scotland Sunday school, and I don't remember really getting it much at all. I don't think I resonated that strongly with the teachings of Jesus or Christianity generally as a child. Probably the most interested that I became in Christianity was just through watching or listening to Jesus Christ Superstar. But that was more just, I suppose, appreciating the artistic expression. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't identify as such, and neither did any of my family, really. I don't know if this was, if I got sent to Sunday school just maybe because my maternal grandparents thought it was a good idea. But either way, I did develop an interest in religion and spirituality and the occult, mostly through films that I watched. And two that stand out to me in particular are Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which features the Thuggee cult in India, which were a real cult that went around murdering people until the British establishment wiped them out in the 19th century. In the film, they worship the Hindu goddess Kali, who's the goddess of death and destruction. Although, in reality, actually, the Thuggees didn't just consist of Kali worshippers. I think some of them might actually have been Muslim as well as Hindu. But the point is, I still thought this was pretty cool, and it got me interested in Hinduism. So I felt drawn to Kali, but also to Shiva as well. And I found the Hindu concept of reincarnation made more sense to me than the Christian and Muslim idea of heaven and hell as far as afterlife goes. The other film that influenced me very strongly was the James Bond film Live and Let Die, which features a voodoo cult that goes around murdering people. And so I got kind of interested in voodoo. I did have a wee voodoo kit, which featured a wee doll with pins and things like that, but thankfully I did not feel that bitter or resentful to anybody in my life that I actually had a proper go at trying to curse anybody. I think these things might not go so well if children dabble in the occult, but yeah, it's maybe to my benefit that I was actually not so determined at that age to do such things. It was more of just like an interest. I didn't really take these things so seriously at the time. This was about the age of 9 or 10 or what have you. But either way, I have noticed that my interests seem to have gone towards either religions which were very connected with nature, so like the Australian Aboriginal religion, for example, or actually quite dark kind of things, like dark occult kind of things. Anything of the sort of dark areas would interest me, you know. So I do remember coming across Satanism, not as like not very in depth, just like the concept of it, and I suppose I found it vaguely interesting at that age. Um, I do remember being taught about uh, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in primary school, but not really being that interested in them in particular. In my first year of high school, I was taught about Buddhism, and I found it that bit more interesting. I suppose you could say, to be honest, I've always probably been more interested in the exotic as opposed to the more traditional religions of the West, Christianity and Judaism, and also Islam as well, part of that broad family. When became a teenager, I started listening to black metal music. Now, occult themes are present in heavy metal music generally, but black metal is it just takes everything to the extreme. And I found this appealing. Not at first when I came across it, but eventually I did start to get interested in it because there's something about black metal music. The themes have a lot to do with, I suppose, really old kind of things. So like not just the occult, but also history and nature as well. And a connection with nature features very strongly in my spirituality, which will become apparently as I go on. I guess at this point, yeah, I kind of just adopted the attitudes of black metal, which was not just to be apathetic to Christianity and the Abrahamic religions, but to become anti-Christian and so on. And I became a lot more interested in these alternative religions like Satanism, Norse neo-paganism, and Wicca. And that did inspire me to some extent, although I still didn't take it that seriously. The closest I got was in the woods near where I lived. I erected a stone circle and built a stone altar in the middle. And one night I decided, around this time I decided, like, okay, I'm going to pick one of these things. I'm going to become a devil worshipper. I'm going to worship Satan. And I sat naked in front of this altar. I'd printed out an image of Baphomet, lit a candle, and just expected something to happen. Of course, nothing did. And so I suppose my conclusion might just have been, okay, well, all this occult stuff must be a load of nonsense. And from that point on, I feel as if I just became very nihilistic, didn't really believe in anything. Which it is important to say that around the same time, I was also heavily into left-wing politics. I self-identified as a Marxist. A lot of this was influenced by the punk rock I was listening to as well as black metal. And yeah, at this point though, I started to become a lot unhappier. It was just reflecting a general unhappiness with life. Wanted a girlfriend, couldn't get one. Was quite stressed at school. There was quite a heavy workload in Scottish schools during the 5th year. And I started listening to black metal, which emphasizes kind of like depressed and suicide, self-harm kind of themes. I don't think this was the best influence on me at the time, but that was just where I was at. Thankfully, some of the other black metal that I was listening to helped to actually take me out of this. Coinciding with like my last year of high school and the sort of slightly lighter workload, I started volunteering at a wildlife visitor centre, and I was becoming much more interested in the music by Slavic pagan metal bands, particularly a Ukrainian band called Nocturnal Mortem. And their expression of their pre-Christian spirituality inspired me so much that I started to really more seriously look into the pre-Christian spirituality of where I live. Now, in the part of Scotland that I live in, there used to be people called the Picts. Before Christianity came, they did convert to Christianity, but before that, obviously, they were pagan. And so I decided to look into their spirituality and Celtic spirituality generally. Yeah, my mental health improved, my life quality improved overall. Went to university, met a lot of great people. Again, though, at this point, though, I was getting really interested in spirituality, but it was still more of a scholarly interest or identity kind of thing rather than an actual practice. The closest I got to an actual practice was, I think it was on one of the festivals. It might have been Halloween, or Samhain in Celtic, where I decided to hold a ritual with a lot of my friends and give offerings to the gods, And I started to get this idea of myself as potentially being part of some sort of Celtic religious revival kind of thing, being some sort of druid. At around the same time, I had started taking psychedelics. Before that, I started off smoking cannabis, but eventually I started taking LSD and things like that. And this sort of thing really started to change my perception of reality. It just coincided with more strong interest in spirituality generally. And so I started listening to men like Alan Watts and Terence McKenna. I started looking at the Ogori cults of India, which are a Shiva worshipping sect, and they're quite extreme in the things they do. They're quite dark in terms of what they're oriented towards. Like they traditionally would eat the flesh from human corpses, paint themselves in ashes, meditate in graveyards, and things like that. And I was practicing the intermittent fasting as a way to prepare for taking psychedelics and things like that. And I did start practicing meditation. So you could say at this point, it was kind of my last year of university, then I actually started doing these spiritual practices. But I was also starting to become very unhappy because I realized that there were certain things about my lifestyle that were having a negative effect on me. I was addicted to sugary junk foods, was addicted to pornography, and I also realized that I'd become dependent on cannabis to avoid feeling certain difficult emotions and things like that. So I was also becoming very interested in far right politics as well. And part of this was under the influence of, ironically, a complete teetotaler, Varg Vikernes. Now, I'd obviously listened to his music project, Bertsum, for a number of years before then. And when I first came across him, I just thought he was a racist idiot. But I started to take his ideas more seriously. Now, I went to university in Edinburgh. And when I first went there, I really appreciated, all of the different peoples that were there, from the Middle East and, other parts of the world. I found this really interesting. I got to try lots of interesting foods that were available from the shops there. But over time, for whatever reason, I suppose I just found that I just didn't like, I suppose, the mixture of all of the different cultures and things like that. I think I might have just started to realize that I'm not much of a city person. And yeah, I just became more kind of drawn towards the countryside. And when I finished uni, I moved back with my parents, which is more in the countryside. And I started to feel better. I started to clean up my act. So I started practicing yoga and became a vegetarian. And things started to improve for me. And I also got into the habit of just wandering about the Highlands smoking weed. And one day I chanced upon a particular type of mushroom, which I wasn't looking for, just came across it. But I knew what it was and started collecting them. And the experiences that I had taking the mushrooms were that bit more significant than, LSD and some of the other psychedelics I'd taken, because I was taking them out in nature. And one notable trip I had a vision of a horned cyclops. I went up to an old hill fort and had a vision of like a faceless being, and eventually it had my face on it. Very strange. But the most significant trip was whenever I had a vision of the Hindu god Ganesh, elephant-headed god, and a being that looked a lot like descriptions of Shiva. It was completely white and had a pointed head, and it had a ball in one of its hands. And at this point, I felt compelled to offer my pipe filled with hashish to it. And turns out I forgot it and had left it in the woods, so I left it as an offering. But at this point, the whole like pagan spirituality became much more real to me after this experience. Like I said before, then it was more like a scholarly interest or identity kind of thing. But this really felt like there was something to it. But at the same time, like I was having these kind of experiences, but overall I was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with life. Being a white nationalist and being dismayed at like the increasing amounts of immigration and things like that was quite upsetting to me at the time. And it was overall becoming quite emotionally chaotic and clear that I needed to work on certain aspects of my life. I did have an interesting experience, and when I went to London to meet up with my partner, whom I met at university, I came across Hare Krishna, and he offered me a copy of the Bhagavad Gita in exchange for a donation. Although I was feeling generous at the time, I didn't mind. But yeah, this is just me starting to get more into spirituality. And soon after this, I came across a man called John St. Julian, who is a Christian mystic, interestingly enough. So, despite myself still being pretty anti-Christian, his take on Christianity is quite different from what I'd come across up until that point. I should emphasize that he is a Gnostic, so a lot of other Christians may not consider him a real Christian because of this. But whatever the case, his take on Christianity interested me because he claims that in the Bible there is esoteric hidden meanings that point to this, you could say, a biochemical process called the sacred secretion. Whereas basically, if you fast for long enough, apparently your brain releases serotonin and DMT and can induce a mystical experience, which he claims is superior to that of psychedelics, because when you take psychedelics, you're ingesting a substance and you have the experience and then it just kind of wears off, whereas he claims that the effects of this sacred secretion are more long lasting. And I thought this, like what he had done, was quite amazing. He fasted for 40 days in imitation of Jesus, probably Moses as well, which is, I consider, to be quite a feat to fast for that long. And yeah, it inspired me to continue the practice of fasting that I'd already been doing for taking psychedelics, but now I was considering just fasting for its own sake. And around about this time, I was still influenced by Varg. And I found that the Germanic expression of spirituality actually appealed to me just that bit more than the Celtic one. So I sort of made a bit of a switch over towards that. And after that, I moved into the flat that I'm currently living in. Now, this was a decision that at the time I was very unhappy with, because it is in a city, and my mental health did decline quite significantly, and yeah, I had to deal with all of these personal issues and so on, and I also noticed that it's around about this time I became very, what you could call, orthopraxic, which is basically kind of fixated on doing things right in a ritual sense. Because one of the things that I had noticed, especially since I became much more, like, I'd learned so much about the things that my pagan ancestors believed, is that I'd almost like started to take on their beliefs and fears and things like that. So around about the time actually I'd my last year of university, when all of this kind of stuff started to ramp up, this was about 11 years ago, I'd started to become quite fearful of the unseen, of demons and so on, and entities, which are apparently negative energies that can attach themselves to people. And this is relevant to the orthopraxy thing because a lot of that was informed by the fact that I wanted to, well, I was interested in how indigenous peoples used psychedelics. And it turns out, for example, the Mazatec in Mexico, whenever they use magic mushrooms, they have much more rigorous fasting. So, like, they fast for a full day before taking the mushrooms, and then also the day after as well, which, I was only fasting for, on the day that I would take the mushrooms. And then once the effects wore off, I would just go back to eating regularly, even sometimes quite sugary food. So I was like, oh my God, I've been doing it wrong. And yeah, no, this wasn't doing well for my mental health because I became quite anxious about doing things correctly. And I was also decided to set up like a kindred. So just like a little group of, I suppose, worshippers of the Norse or Germanic gods, but with a pretty, I suppose, racist slant. And I was the leader of the rituals and so on. Now, one thing that actually happened was, it was only three of us, and one of the members ended up, we ended up having a sort of falling out. And part of this was because he got a new girlfriend. And I actually felt so bitter about this that I actually started the process of trying to curse them to get them to break up, which I just couldn't go through with. So I suppose I feel proud of that fact that I was going to do this, and who knows, it might not have worked, but if it had, I don't know how badly I would have felt about that, but I'm very glad that I didn't, because that sort of thing is just, yeah, I'm glad I didn't do it, let's say that much. But from this point on, I was looking into esoteric National Socialism, and I came across two sources which I found very interesting. There's a website called Arianism.net, and they have a very peculiar interpretation of National Socialism. They're almost more like quite typical leftists in their outlook. They claim that the Nazis weren't racist, that the Aryan concept is actually more of like a moral thing, which is kind of similar to actually what the term Aryan means in India, for example. But yeah, I find this kind of interesting, and I actually started to seriously consider their arguments. I also came across the teachings of a man named Karl Maria Villegut, who was Himmler's guru, that's what he's been called, But his spirituality is very interesting because it was a weird type of Germanic Christianity. His idea was that the original religion of the Germanic peoples was more like, or like a pure form of Christianity, rather than the type of spirituality that you would read about in, let's say, the Norse Eddas and so on, which he considered to be like a degeneration of this original, what he called Christianism. And he claims that, contemporary Christianity is like a Judaized bastardization of this original sort of Germanic spirituality. These days, I consider this is probably bollocks, but I found it very interesting at the time because what I was starting to realize was that as I was getting into religion and esoterica more deeply, I was starting to realize how racism is not very compatible with the mystical teachings that are to be found in the religions of the world, which emphasize much more of just like a unity of everything, not just humanity. And I suppose the crux point came when I had, you could say, an encounter with my shadow, which is a psychological concept. I think it's a Jungian one. And basically the background for this is that I was in a band at the time with a friend of mine and my partner. This friend was also my weed dealer. And he came up to the city that I live in for a jam. And there was the possibility of having a joint. And I remember, we were just sitting by the river and I kind of decided, well, I would quite like one, but the offer isn't being raised, so I'll just suggest it. I'll just be like, oh, maybe we should have a joint. And once I started smoking it, I realized how I'd basically manipulated my friend into getting what I want. So rather than just, waiting for the offer to come up and accepting it if it did, or just letting it be if it didn't, I'd sort of contrived this to get something that I wanted. And I've found this, I suppose, to be quite manipulative. And I wasn't really aware of this before then. But it seems to have had something of a destabilizing effect on my psyche, because the next day I watched a video by a Christian fundamentalist on YouTube, and he inspired me to throw away my idol to Odin and become a Christian. Still within the Germanic thing, like I was still identified with that whole stuff, because, like I said, Karl Maria Villigut and to some extent Arianism.net sort of endorsed that kind of thing. Which, yeah, it was. I think I was at that point like quite confused internally about, what I was into and so on. You could say that I lost faith a bit, went a bit nuts. I had invoked Loki before this point because, along with the orthopraxia thing, I had become quite fixated on which particular tradition to focus on, whether the Norse tradition or the Anglo-Saxon tradition. This wasn't new. I had had this problem when I was more into the Celtic stuff. It was like, oh, am I more into the sort of Pictish thing, or am I maybe more into the Gaelic thing? It's just one of these things that I suppose I've struggled with at times, like this kind of rigidness and fixation on things. I have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Apparently this is a trait of people like this, but I like to think that I'm getting more flexible over time. But yeah, at this point, I guess, to be honest, actually, though, what I did helped free up my myself in a way, because, like I said, I abandoned racism basically and started to just consider mysticism more generally. I did consider being initiated in some sort of tradition like Sufism, which is traditionally a Muslim thing, although I think a man called Inayat Khan founded a type of Sufism that is not exclusively Muslim. I also considered Tibetan Buddhism as well, but I ultimately decided, no, I just want to, I'm going to just do my own thing. Was still quite paranoid, quite fearful at this point. And it's ironically around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic that I actually started to disengage from a lot of the media that I'd been consuming. And by this point, I wasn't smoking cannabis anymore. I wasn't even taking any kind of drug anymore. Wasn't watching porn anymore or consuming junk food. Got a much healthier diet, although it became a little bit what they call orthorexic. So just like I need to be eating very specific things and also at quite specific times and all this kind of stuff. So I was starting to deal with much stronger anxiety. And I think a lot of the reason for this was because I'd got rid of these like coping mechanisms that I'd been using to escape from those feelings. But in any case, I suppose actually at this point I kind of did what I had done as a teenager that helped me get out of it, which was just to focus more on the things I was interested in rather than the things that I was afraid of. And this did help, although to be honest, my spiritual experience became somewhat less vivid over, the early part of the 2020s. I did start practicing energy work, as taught by a man called Jeffrey Allen. Started getting interested in sort of new age alien sort of spirituality. I have a friend that does soul readings and got told about my soul, like where it comes from, which like star system, and my life lessons and so on. So that was quite interesting. But at a certain point, I did start to feel, in particular, a disconnection from nature. And around about that time, I came across a man called Kenton Whitman, who runs an organization called Rewild University, which has a YouTube channel, so that's how I came across him. But now, this might not seem so spiritual, the kind of things that he has talked about that I started to practice. So things like cold conditioning, where, you basically just, you deliberately wear less clothing when it's cold so as to actually feel the cold a little bit more. But like, as will become apparent, connection with nature is very strongly part of my spirituality. I also started to hug trees as well, just to try and get more of that connection with nature. Now, around about this time last year, I was starting to have a more stressful time in my life. I was required to look for work as part of being on benefits. I was starting to feel less happy with my situation, quite frustrated. And one day I was meditating in the woods, which I hadn't done for a long time. I sort of fell out of the habit once the lockdowns came into force. And after my meditation, I decided to hug a tree. And at that point, I experienced an erection, which I thought was very interesting. This has never happened before. And what it immediately put me in mind of was the fact that in this part of the world, pagan kings would symbolically marry the land, draw their virility from it, and so on. I believe that there's something very true in this. Like, there's something very real. And I feel like I personally can actually, I seem to be able to tap into this, like this virility that comes from the land itself. The connection between land and folk is something that has been, this has been an important concept to me, especially since I started getting interested in the Celtic pagan stuff. But it only started to become even more real for me at this point. And my experience of reality really started to change quite dramatically. And I started taking more spontaneous actions, like just going skinny dipping, just out of the blue, for example. And just like spending a lot more time in nature, but also, just like getting very deeply in touch with my intuition, which is something which I'd been working on for a long time before then. At first, this was very fun, like, and I was just like, I would have spontaneous ideas just to visit like a random hill or something like that, which I would usually plan things out beforehand before then, but now I was being a lot more, spontaneous about things. Over time, though, this became quite overwhelming mentally. I'm not sure exactly where it started to go wrong, but I did end up with a job as a support worker with autistic people. But I found that I think I quickly realized it wasn't for me, that I would prefer to be self-employed, like working on my creative projects, but it was part of the conditions of being on benefits that I needed to get a job. So it was quite a frustrating situation for me. And at the same time, I had also started to practice telepathic communication with mushrooms. Now, this is a concept that was introduced to me by my former flatmate, a man I consider my best friend, all the way, 11 years ago or so. And he was doing this when encountering the red and white mushroom called fly agaric, as a way to sort of ask its permission to, take it and use it. At the time, I was like, "What, you can? This can't be possible, can it?" But round about this time, in the autumn of 2024, I had started to do this as a way to try and intuitively figure out whether I could eat, like whether mushrooms are edible or not. I don't recommend anybody try this because it's incredibly dangerous, but I felt called to do it. So, and I ended up doing it, and I did not poison myself at any point doing it. So, whether I was just lucky or whether I really was able to tap into my intuition and communicate with these mushrooms, or whether my body had just become really resistant to poisons over time, who knows? Yeah, it's quite miraculous, I suppose. But either way, this and the sort of tense situation with the job that I had at the time, it actually seems to have contributed to a mental breakdown, and I actually tried to kill myself, which I'm not going to go into detail about here. I'll maybe tell that story some other time. But after this experience, I became pretty actually, to be honest, I was becoming depressed at points already before this point. I was starting to have these quite bad experiences of, making decisions and then regretting them a lot. Feeling like I was like getting into these catch-22s with my decisions. So I think it was kind of flagging up for me that I've had a lot of psychological issues that need sorting out. But either way, what I have learned over time since then is that I think part of the problem that I had was that I was probably a bit ungrounded. I didn't really have so much in the way of a regular spiritual practice. I was practicing Galdr, which is singing the runes, most evenings, before I had these changes happening. And that was kind of like my regular routine, which I sort of lost over time as I was doing things more spontaneously and emphasizing just doing things on the fly. But I do think it is quite important to have these like regular rituals and routines, because they help to give you some grounding and stability in the world of occult and spirituality, because it can get very intense. The intensity has eased off a lot for me recently. Thankfully, I've been able to come out of the depression that I was in. I still struggle with, I suppose, what you could call psychotic symptoms at times, and I'm still having to work through a lot of the problems that I've experienced as a result. But I suppose I just want to say that I feel like my own experience is proof that you can come out of like very bad experiences like suicide attempts and depression without medication. I should emphasize I was offered medication by psychiatrists, and I refused the offer, and I'm getting better like myself. I was taking magic mushrooms again, but that they didn't really help that much because I actually think I was quite closed off at the time. The trips that I was having were very dark. So I don't recommend that people who are in a very dark place take psychedelics. It's not fun, you know. Partly it was actually because I had one of these times of regretting the decision, thinking maybe it's better if I microdose. No, I really should take them. Uh, a lot of this has had to do with things like intrusive thoughts, which again I might get into some other time. But whatever the case, yeah, that's basically my story. Hopefully, I'll be able to talk to you more about just the knowledge that I've gained over the years from reading about spirituality, various like motifs in mythology and religions, and also just a bit about my personal experience as well. So if you've made it this far, thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Cheers.